The elderly rabbi pauses mid-sentence, his finger tracing the ancient Hebrew text as 30 graduate students lean forward in anticipation. Professor David Stern has been teaching biblical studies at Yale for 47 years, and he's encountered this moment countless times before, the moment when a brilliant student notices something that doesn't quite add up. Today, it's Sarah, a sharp-eyed doctoral candidate who's been methodically working through the book of Genesis. Professor, she says hesitantly, I'm reading the creation account and I'm confused. In Genesis chapter 1, it says humans were created last after all the animals. But in chapter 2, it says Adam was created first before any animals existed. Which one is right? Professor Stern smiles, not with the smugness of someone about to deliver a crushing blow, but with the satisfaction of a teacher who's been waiting for this exact question. Congratulations, Sarah, he says quietly. You've just discovered one of the most fascinating aspects of biblical literature. It's full of contradictions that no one tried to hide. This moment of discovery happens in seminaries, universities, and living rooms around the world every day, as readers encountering the Bible with fresh eyes stumble upon discrepancies that scholars have been discussing for centuries. But here's what makes these contradictions truly remarkable. They weren't accidental oversights or scribal errors. They were preserved intentionally by editors who could have easily harmonized them but chose not to. The question isn't whether these contradictions exist, it's why they were allowed to remain. The Bible, the world's most widely read and influential book, contains some of the most glaring internal inconsistencies in all of literature. Stories that contradict each other, genealogies that don't add up, commands that directly oppose each other, and historical accounts that present completely different versions of the same events. Yet these contradictions weren't hidden away in obscure footnotes. They were placed side by side, sometimes in consecutive chapters as if daring readers to notice. Take the story everyone thinks they know, Noah's Ark. Sunday school classes around the world teach children that Noah took 2 of every kind of animal onto the ark. It's one of the most iconic images in religious art. Pairs of elephants, giraffes, and lions walking peacefully up a wooden gangplank. But read Genesis carefully and you'll discover that this familiar version isn't the only one the Bible tells. In Genesis 6:19, God instructs Noah to take 2 of every sort of animal onto the ark. But just 1 chapter later, in Genesis 7:2, God tells Noah to take 7 pairs of every clean animal and only 1 pair of unclean animals. 2 completely different sets of instructions preserved in the same story with no attempt to reconcile them. This isn't a translation issue or a copying mistake. The Hebrew text clearly presents 2 distinct commands that cannot both be literally true. Yet biblical editors preserved both versions, placing them so close together that any careful reader would immediately notice the discrepancy. Why would they do such a thing? The answer reveals something profound about how ancient literature worked and how the Bible was actually compiled. These weren't contradictions to be solved. They were different traditions to be honored, multiple voices speaking across centuries about the same foundational events. Consider the genealogies that trace the line from Adam to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 5, we get one carefully constructed family tree with specific ages for each patriarch. Methuselah lives 969 years, Enoch lives 365 years and then walks with God without dying, and Noah lives 950 years. The numbers are precise, the lineage is clear, and the chronology seems straightforward. But when you compare this genealogy to the version in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, you find names that appear in different orders, lifespans that don't match, and generations that seem to be missing entirely. Then, when you cross-reference both of these with the genealogy that appears in Luke's Gospel, you discover a third version that contradicts both of the earlier ones. 3 different genealogies, all claiming to trace the same family line, all preserved as authoritative scripture. The contradictions aren't subtle. They're impossible to miss once you place the texts side by side, yet no biblical editor ever attempted to create a single harmonized version. The story of David's rise to power presents even more dramatic contradictions that reveal the complex process of how biblical narratives were assembled. Most people know the story of David and Goliath. the young shepherd boy who slays the mighty Philistine warrior with a slingshot. It's a tale of faith triumphing over overwhelming odds, of God empowering the weak to defeat the strong. But 2 Samuel 21:19 tells a completely different story. In this version, Goliath is killed not by David, but by a warrior named Elhanan. Not only is the hero different, but the context is entirely different too. This isn't a young shepherd facing his first battle. This is an experienced soldier in an ongoing military campaign. Both accounts exist in the same Bible, both claim to describe the death of Goliath, the Gittite, and both are presented as historically accurate. No footnote explains the discrepancy. No editor suggests that one version is metaphorical while the other is literal. They simply coexist, preserved for posterity like competing newspaper accounts of the same event. The contradictions become even more striking when we examine the Ten Commandments, perhaps the most famous moral code in human history. Everyone knows that Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, carved in stone by the finger of God. But how many people realize that the Bible actually gives us two completely different versions of these commandments? Exodus 20 presents one version of the Ten Commandments, and Deuteronomy 5 presents another. At first glance, they seem similar, but careful comparison reveals significant differences. The commandment about the Sabbath, for instance, gives completely different justifications for why it should be observed. In Exodus, the Sabbath commandment refers back to God's rest after creation. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. But in Deuteronomy, the justification is entirely different. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Same commandment, same divine authority, completely different theological reasoning. One version grounds Sabbath observance in the rhythm of creation itself. The other grounds it in the historical experience of liberation from slavery. Both can't be the original divine wording, yet both are preserved as authentic scripture. Hello, history enthusiasts. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the fascinating complexities that shape our understanding of the past. Before we continue exploring these remarkable textual puzzles, I'm curious about our diverse audience today. Where are you watching from right now? Are you perhaps in a university library studying comparative religion, or maybe at home on a quiet Sunday morning? And here's something that might give us insight into different perspectives on this topic. What do you do for work? Are you a biblical scholar wrestling with these questions professionally? Maybe a pastor or seminary student encountering these issues in your training? A lawyer who appreciates textual analysis? Or simply someone who enjoys exploring complex intellectual puzzles? Your background probably influences how you're processing these contradictions. The story of Jesus' genealogy presents perhaps the most famous contradiction in the New Testament, one that has puzzled readers for nearly 2,000 years. Both Matthew and Luke trace Jesus' lineage back through history, but they tell completely different stories about his family tree. Matthew's Gospel traces Jesus' ancestry through his father Joseph, listing 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus. The genealogy moves through the royal line of David, emphasizing Jesus' connection to Israel's greatest king. It's a carefully constructed lineage designed to establish Jesus' credentials as the long-awaited Messiah. Luke's Gospel also traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, but presents a completely different family tree. Where Matthew counts 42 generations, Luke counts 77. The names are different, the time periods don't match, and even the route back to David follows a different family line entirely. But here's where the contradiction becomes truly puzzling. Both Gospels also claim that Joseph wasn't actually Jesus' biological father. If Jesus was conceived by divine intervention, why do both genealogies trace his ancestry through Joseph? And if they're both tracing the same adoptive father's lineage, how can they be so completely different? Early Christian scholars recognized this problem immediately and developed elaborate explanations to reconcile the contradictions. Some suggested that one genealogy traced Joseph's line while the other traced Mary's. Others proposed that one was a legal genealogy while the other was biological. But these explanations require reading details into the text that simply aren't there. What's most remarkable is that the gospel authors seem completely unconcerned by these contradictions. Matthew and Luke don't acknowledge that they're presenting different genealogies, don't explain why their versions differ, and don't seem to feel any need to harmonize their accounts. They tell their stories as if theirs is the only version that exists. The death of Judas Iscariot presents another striking contradiction that reveals how different New Testament authors understood the same events in fundamentally different ways. The story of Jesus' betrayal is central to Christian theology, but the Bible preserves two completely incompatible accounts of what happened to the betrayer afterward. Matthew's gospel reports that Judas was overcome with remorse after Jesus was condemned. He returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests, declared, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood," and then went out and hanged himself. The priests used the returned money to buy a potter's field, which became known as the Field of Blood. The Acts of the Apostles tells a completely different story. In this version, Judas uses the money from his betrayal to buy a field for himself. But instead of hanging himself, he falls headlong in this field. His body bursts open, and his intestines spill out. The field becomes known as the Field of Blood because of this gruesome death. Two accounts, same betrayer, same field name, completely different deaths. Matthew presents Judas as consumed by guilt and choosing suicide. Acts presents him as meeting a violent accidental death while spending his ill-gotten gains. Both versions claim to explain how the Field of Blood got its name, but they give entirely different origins for that name. These aren't subtle differences that could be harmonized through careful interpretation. They're fundamentally incompatible accounts that cannot both be literally accurate. Yet both were preserved in the New Testament canon as authoritative accounts of historical events. The creation accounts in Genesis present perhaps the most systematic set of contradictions in the entire Bible. Contradictions so clear and detailed that they've shaped centuries of theological debate. Most readers know that Genesis begins with the story of creation, but fewer realize that it actually contains two completely different creation stories placed back to back. Genesis chapter 1 presents creation as a carefully ordered process taking place over 6 days. God creates light and darkness, then sky and water, then dry land and plants, then sun and moon and stars, then fish and birds, then land animals, and finally humans, both male and female together. It's a cosmic, systematic account where everything proceeds in logical order. Genesis chapter 2 tells a completely different story. Here, creation begins with God forming a man from dust before any plants exist on earth. Then God plants a garden, creates trees and rivers, and only after all this does God decide that it is not good for man to be alone. So God forms animals and brings them to the man to see what he would call them. Finally, when none of the animals proves to be a suitable companion, God creates woman from the man's rib. The order is completely reversed. In chapter 1, plants come before humans. In chapter 2, humans come before plants. In chapter 1, animals are created before humans. In chapter 2, humans are created before animals. In chapter 1, male and female are created simultaneously. In chapter 2, the male is created first, then animals, then finally the female. These aren't different perspectives on the same events. They're incompatible accounts that describe fundamentally different sequences of creation. Yet biblical editors place them side by side without any attempt to harmonize them or explain the differences. The story of the flood presents similar contradictions woven throughout the same narrative. We've already seen the contradiction about how many animals Noah was supposed to take, but that's just the beginning. The flood account preserves multiple different traditions about how long the flood lasted, how deep the water got, and how the flood ended. According to one tradition preserved in the text, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. According to another tradition, the flood lasted for 150 days. One version says the water covered the highest mountains by 15 cubits. Another suggests the flooding was more localized. One tradition reports that Noah sent out a dove 3 times before it didn't return. Another tradition mentions a raven that was sent out and never came back. These different traditions have been woven together so skillfully that casual readers might not notice the contradictions. But careful analysis reveals multiple distinct accounts that have been combined into a single narrative. The editors preserved details from different versions even when they contradicted each other, creating a composite story that honors multiple traditions simultaneously. The conquest of Canaan under Joshua presents some of the most dramatic contradictions in the historical books of the Hebrew Bible. The book of Joshua describes a swift, complete conquest where the Israelites annihilate all their enemies and take possession of the entire promised land within a few years. Joshua 11:23 declares triumphantly, "So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war." The conquest is total, the victory is complete, and the land belongs entirely to Israel. But the very next book, Judges, tells a completely different story. Judges 1 describes the same conquest as partial, difficult, and incomplete. Tribe after tribe fails to drive out the original inhabitants of their territories. The text repeatedly notes that various tribes could not drive out or did not drive out the peoples living in their assigned territories. The Jebusites continue to live in Jerusalem alongside the tribe of Judah. The Canaanites remain in their cities, though they're subjected to forced labor. The conquest that Joshua describes as total and complete is revealed in Judges to be partial and ongoing. These aren't different conquests separated by years or decades. They're supposed to describe the same historical events. Yet one source presents complete victory while another presents ongoing struggle. Both versions were preserved in the biblical canon as authoritative accounts of Israel's early history. The laws governing slavery reveal another type of contradiction that has created enormous interpretive challenges throughout history. The Hebrew Bible contains multiple legal codes that address slavery, but they provide completely different and sometimes contradictory rules for how slaves should be treated. Exodus 21 allows Hebrew slaves to be freed after 6 years of service, but makes an exception for slaves who choose to remain with their masters permanently. It also allows masters to sell their daughters into slavery and provides rules for when and how female slaves can be released. But Deuteronomy 15 presents different rules entirely. It also mandates freedom after 6 years, but adds requirements that masters must provide freed slaves with generous provisions: livestock, grain, and wine to help them restart their lives. The tone and specifics are quite different from the Exodus version. Leviticus 25 introduces yet another set of slavery laws that contradict both Exodus and Deuteronomy. This passage distinguishes between Hebrew slaves, who must be treated as hired workers and released during the Jubilee year, and foreign slaves, who can be bought, sold, and inherited as permanent property. 3 different legal codes, 3 different approaches to slavery, all preserved as divine law. The contradictions aren't subtle. They involve fundamental questions about who can be enslaved, for how long, and under what conditions. Yet no biblical editor attempted to create a unified slavery law that would resolve these differences. The accounts of Saul's death present another dramatic example of contradictory historical narratives preserved side by side. The first book of Samuel provides 2 completely different accounts of how Israel's first king met his end, accounts that cannot possibly both be true. In 1 Samuel 31, Saul is wounded in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. Seeing that the battle is lost and fearing capture, Saul asks his armor-bearer to kill him. When the armor-bearer refuses, Saul falls on his own sword and dies. The armor-bearer then kills himself as well. The Philistines later find Saul's body and cut off his head. But in 2 Samuel chapter 1, a young Amalekite man comes to David claiming to have killed Saul himself. According to this account, the Amalekite found Saul leaning on his spear, still alive but mortally wounded. Saul begged the young man to finish him off, which he did, taking Saul's crown and bracelet as proof. Same king, same battle, 2 completely different deaths. In one version, Saul dies by his own hand after his armor-bearer refuses to help. In the other version, Saul dies at the hands of an Amalekite who then brings proof to David. David's reaction in the second account, executing the Amalekite for killing God's anointed, makes clear that this is presented as historical fact, not as the young man's fictional claim. The contradictions extend beyond historical narratives into fundamental theological questions about God's nature and character. Perhaps nowhere is this more striking than in the question of whether God changes his mind or remains unchanging. The book of Numbers tells the story of God becoming angry with the Israelites and deciding to destroy them completely, but then changing his mind after Moses intercedes on their behalf. Exodus describes God relenting from the disaster he had planned to bring on his people. The book of Jonah shows God changing his decision to destroy Nineveh after the city repents. Yet other biblical passages declare emphatically that God never changes. 1 Samuel 15:29 states that the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. Numbers 23:19 asks rhetorically, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. The Bible presents both perspectives as equally true. God as one who responds to human actions by changing his plans, and God as one whose nature is unchanging and whose decisions are irrevocable. These aren't different aspects of the same truth. They're logically contradictory claims about divine nature. The question of whether humans can see God presents another fundamental theological contradiction. Exodus 33:20 reports God telling Moses, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." This seems to establish a clear principle. Direct vision of God is impossible for mortals. But the same book of Exodus, just a few chapters earlier, describes Moses, Aaron, and 70 elders of Israel going up Mount Sinai where they saw the God of Israel, and they beheld God, and ate and drank. Genesis describes Jacob wrestling with God face to face, saying afterward, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved." The contradiction isn't about seeing God indirectly through visions or dreams. These passages describe direct, physical encounters with the divine. Yet they coexist with equally clear statements that such encounters are impossible. The genealogies present mathematical contradictions that have puzzled scholars for centuries. When you trace the chronologies given in various biblical books, you discover that the numbers simply don't add up consistently. The Book of Kings provides specific dates for the reigns of various monarchs in both Israel and Judah, often cross-referencing them to synchronize the chronologies of both kingdoms. But when scholars add up these numbers and compare them to external historical records, they find discrepancies that cannot be resolved through any reasonable historical interpretation. Some reigns are too long, others too short. Some events that are supposed to be contemporary are separated by decades according to the chronologies. Some kings appear to overlap with their predecessors or successors in impossible ways. These aren't minor discrepancies that could be explained by different calendar systems or scribal errors. They're systematic contradictions that reveal different chronological traditions being preserved within the same biblical books. The prophecies about the Messiah present theological contradictions that have shaped centuries of religious interpretation. Different biblical books describe the coming Messianic figure in ways that seem impossible to reconcile within a single person. Some prophecies describe a political ruler who will establish justice and peace through earthly power. Others describe a suffering servant who will be rejected and killed. Some emphasize military victory over Israel's enemies. Others emphasize spiritual redemption through sacrifice. Some prophecies suggest the Messiah will come from the lineage of David and rule from Jerusalem. Others seem to suggest a more universal figure whose influence extends beyond ethnic Israel. Some describe dramatic supernatural interventions in history. Others describe gradual social and spiritual transformations. Christians have traditionally resolved these contradictions by claiming they're all fulfilled in Jesus through his two comings, first as suffering servant, later as conquering king. But reading the prophecies in their original context reveals genuine tensions between different messianic expectations that may not have been intended to describe the same person. The legal codes contain practical contradictions that would have made consistent legal application impossible. Different biblical books present different rules for similar situations, creating scenarios where faithful adherence to Scripture could require contradictory actions. The laws about lending and interest provide clear examples. Deuteronomy 23:19-20 forbids charging interest when lending to fellow Israelites, but permits charging interest when lending to foreigners. But Leviticus 25:35-37 seems to forbid charging interest altogether, making no distinction between Israelites and foreigners. The laws about divorce present similar contradictions. Deuteronomy 24:1-4 provides procedures for divorce and remarriage, acknowledging that these practices will occur and should be regulated, but other passages suggest that divorce is never permitted under any circumstances. These aren't different applications of the same principles to different situations. They're contradictory rules about the same practices. Ancient legal scholars would have faced impossible choices when trying to apply these laws consistently. The archaeological evidence adds another layer to these textual contradictions. Many events described in detail in biblical narratives leave no trace in the archaeological record, while the archaeological record reveals historical developments that the biblical narratives ignore or contradict. The conquest narratives describe the destruction of numerous Canaanite cities, but archaeological excavations at many of these sites show no evidence of violent destruction during the proposed time periods. Some cities that the Bible describes as major population centers appear to have been uninhabited at the relevant times. Conversely, the archaeological record shows significant cultural and political developments in ancient Israel and surrounding regions that receive no mention in biblical histories. The contradictions aren't just between different biblical accounts, they're between biblical accounts and the material evidence left by the civilizations these texts claim to describe. The wisdom literature presents philosophical contradictions about fundamental questions of human existence. The book of Ecclesiastes advocates a kind of resigned hedonism, suggesting that since life is ultimately meaningless, people should simply enjoy whatever pleasures they can find. But Proverbs advocates disciplined living according to divine principles, promising that righteousness leads to prosperity and happiness. Both books are attributed to Solomon and preserved as equally authoritative wisdom, yet they offer fundamentally different approaches to life's challenges and meaning. Ecclesiastes sees life as vanity and recommends eating, drinking, and making merry. Proverbs sees life as governed by divine justice and recommends careful moral living. These contradictions have generated thousands of years of interpretive effort. Scholars have developed sophisticated hermeneutical methods for reading biblical texts that acknowledge contradictions while maintaining religious authority. They've proposed historical explanations for how different sources were combined, literary explanations for how contradictions serve artistic purposes, and theological explanations for how divine truth can be expressed through apparently incompatible human words. But perhaps the most important lesson from these contradictions involves what they reveal about how ancient literature actually worked. The Bible wasn't composed as a single systematic work by a single author with a unified perspective. It's an anthology that preserves multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and multiple traditions about the same fundamental questions. The editors who compiled these texts could have harmonized the contradictions, could have chosen single versions of stories, could have created systematic theological consistency. Instead, they chose to preserve diversity, to honor multiple traditions, to allow different voices to speak across centuries about the most fundamental questions of human existence. This approach reflects a profound recognition that absolute truth might be too large and complex for any single human perspective to capture completely. The contradictions don't represent failures of editing, they represent acknowledgments that divine reality and human experience are rich enough to require multiple approaches, multiple stories, and multiple interpretations. The contradictions also reveal how the Bible functioned in its original communities. Rather than serving as a systematic theological textbook or a precise historical record, it served as a library of resources that different communities could draw upon for different purposes in different circumstances. When communities needed to emphasize divine justice, they could turn to passages that stressed God's unchanging righteousness. When they needed to emphasize divine mercy, they could turn to passages that stressed God's willingness to change his mind in response to human repentance. When they needed to encourage resistance against oppression, they could draw upon traditions about divine liberation. When they needed to encourage acceptance of difficult circumstances, they could draw upon traditions about divine sovereignty. The contradictions weren't problems to be solved, but resources to be utilized. They provided theological flexibility that allowed the same text to address vastly different historical circumstances and community needs. Modern readers often struggle with this approach because we've been trained to expect consistency from authoritative texts. Scientific literature maintains consistency through peer review and revision. Legal literature maintains consistency through systematic interpretation and precedent. Academic literature maintains consistency through logical argumentation and evidence. But ancient religious literature often functioned differently. Rather than providing systematic answers to predetermined questions, it preserved multiple perspectives that could generate ongoing dialogue and interpretation. The contradictions weren't bugs in the system. They were features that enabled the text to remain relevant across changing circumstances. This doesn't mean that ancient editors were unconcerned with truth or accuracy. Rather, it suggests that they understood truth as something larger and more complex than could be captured through simple consistency. They seem to have believed that the most important truths about divine reality and human existence required multiple approaches, multiple stories, and multiple interpretations. The preservation of contradictions also reflects ancient understandings of how communities maintain their identity across time. Rather than defining themselves through rigid adherence to unchanging doctrines, communities defined themselves through ongoing engagement with foundational texts that were rich enough and complex enough to address new circumstances while maintaining continuity with the past. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most fascinating aspects of biblical literature. These contradictions raise profound questions about the nature of truth, authority, and interpretation that continue to shape religious and scholarly discussions today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how communities should handle contradictions in their foundational texts. Do you see them as problems to be solved or resources to be appreciated? Have you encountered similar patterns in other ancient literature or religious traditions? Share your perspectives in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Professor Archive for more explorations into the complex realities behind the texts and traditions that have shaped human civilization. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep appreciating the beautiful complexity of human attempts to understand our place in the universe.